Welcome to C's first seminar of the 2026 season. What happens in January 1st, 2026 is that your membership rolls over. If you have an annual membership, your membership just ended. And we'd love for you to sign up for 2026. If you want to become a permanent member like I did, it costs a little more, but then you don't have to remember it. No one's bugging you ever again. So, any questions before we get started? So this is Dave Bone. He's been with C for about 70 years. He started in 1990, by the way, right here in Bandon. It is a Bandon only nonprofit. Okay. So this is a really special thing in my mind that this little tiny town got a nonprofit started that does all these wonderful things. And then we get amazing people that come and help us out. So.
Okay, I have the honor of introducing Mike, our speaker, who most of you probably already know, or you've seen the flyers and you've seen his credentials. So I'm going to introduce you to him. As far as he's concerned, he's one of the legends. Clear way back in the beginning, he was one of the instructors. And they had a much more intensive training program to go through than we do now. And Mike's been with us for all that time. Later on, we made it easier on him. He would give us a 2 to 3 hour presentation in the morning. We'd eat lunch, and then we'd go on a field trip. Now, one of the things Mike always told us, and his wife Jan always told us, when you people are out there, you're answering a lot of questions that we won't have to. Otherwise, people would be calling them on the phone, asking this or that. And he said, that takes us away from doing our main job. So you guys are helping the animals quite a bit by taking this over. So I would really encourage you to think about helping our professional conservationists by joining C as an interpreter. Because let's face it, with what's going on, they're really few in numbers now, and they're overworked and underpaid. And we could go into some other things there, but I won't. Okay, what else here? Let's see. Give you an example. Talk about those field trips. Mike is a mature individual, and he's been mature since I've known him. Well, one day we went on one of these afternoon field trips, and he had just been talking about hybrid dogs. And by golly, he saw one. He had never seen one before. And if I didn't have the cane, I would do this and show you how he jumped up and down because he was so thrilled with that. That was the bridge in Charleston. I don't know if you remember that or not, but you made an impression. What kind of an example does he set? Try this. I had a great opportunity once of going to Washington, D.C. to ask funds for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Walk into the door of Fazio's office, and there's this voice I recognize. You just as well go home. We've got all the money. Mike was already in there. In our two groups, we were so happy to see each other. We got talking. The Fazio staff on us said, look, you guys are here to talk to us, not each other. You do that at home. Okay, if you insist. And the thing that I will talk about that means the most to me, roughly 45 years ago, shortly after I started teaching, every year in October, you have to go to an in-service. And I found this one that looked interesting. I'm from Iowa. Guess what? There's no oceans there. Not even big lakes, really. But there was this workshop on the coast. And so since the district was paying for it, that's why I'm going to the coast. One of the main speakers was Mike. Mike, you're the reason I'm still here after 45 years. And you just so thrilled me with everything that was here to learn that I'm still in kindergarten. So anyway, with no further ado, Mike Graybill.
Wow, thanks, Dave. That was too kind. I just realized that I have been in this since the beginning. And in fact, I've been in this at giving presentations at Bandon since before C, because I don't know if any Bandonites recall that there was another organization called Bandon Storm Watchers. A very similar group of people interested in the natural world, but it was sort of a tourism promotion thing that coastal communities were doing because, you know, there's the dip in a visitation in the winter time. And the Oregon coast in the winter, we all know, is a pretty darn exciting place when these big swells and these giant ocean storms come. So someone thoughtfully recognized that, wow, you know, if we promote this storm watching concept, perhaps we can get a boost to visitation. And so the Bandon Storm Watchers was one of these informational things that's on a stormy winter Saturday, we would gather at the Bandon Barn and give presentations. And I was a graduate student at the time that I started giving seminars at Bandon Storm Watchers. So it's been pushing 50 some years that I've been coming to Bandon and sharing my interest in the natural world. So I'm just going to ask for a little bit of assistance here because my screen just vaporized on me. What happened here? Just touch my hand. Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks. Okay, so I've been variously back and forth to give presentations about seabirds, which is a subject area that's of interest to me and part of my professional background. But I've also been the instructor for a class called the Biology of Seabirds and Marine Mammals. So variously, I've been called upon by folks like Dave to give presentations about marine vertebrates. So on one hand, it could be birds. On the other hand, it could be mammals. This year, Jan's going to do the mammals, my partner, and I'll do the coastal birds presentation. So I have in my mind this presentation such that you will be the ambassadors and that many of you, I see shirts and the like on, will actually do this volunteer docent training where you will go out with the scopes that sea has and stand at the coast overlooking seabird colonies or overlooking Cape Arago or up at the Bandon Marsh and greet people. Just you would be hanging out there while people voluntarily show up following their own interest in the natural world. So I've put a presentation together so that you can become sort of a resource expert, or at least one step more familiar than someone from the general public that might come up. So that I'll try and give you a framework of how to think about the birds that you might be experiencing from a lookout over here over the seabird colonies at Bandon, or a lookout up at Cape Arago, or a lookout over at Bandon Marsh National Wildlife Refuge. Is that good, Dave?
I love it.
Okay, all right. So, see how this works. No. Well, I can't advance my slide. Button. There we go. How'd you do that? Magic fingers. So I'm thinking about birds that frequent the coast, coastal birds, and I will break that down because I'm a scientist and scientists do reductionist things. So we put things in categories, but it's a nice way of binning things so that you can think about them. So some coastal birds, there's a couple of terms we'll discuss: shorebirds, coastal birds, waterfowl, waders, pelagic. Those are terms that are common parlance in this realm. There's also another way of thinking about birds that associate with the ocean. That's what a marine bird is, a bird that associates with the ocean. There's two kinds of birds that associate with the ocean. One kind is a bird that in their entire life is spent in association with the ocean. But there's another group of birds who breed inland in terrestrial environments, but then they move to the coast in the non-breeding season and spend most of their year associated with the ocean. So when you look out and see a seabird or a bird in the ocean, you can start to think, well, geez, does it spend its entire life there? Or does it have another piece of its existence that we're not experiencing because we're looking at the ocean, but these birds have other things going on? So bird geeks in the room? Anybody bird enthusiasts? Okay, I threw a couple of ringers in here just to keep people's attention focused. But you can think of the world split in two kinds of birds. There's passerine birds. Those are the birds that are in the bushes out here. They're sparrows and robins, and the birds that I think most of us are most familiar with. But the focus here is on marine birds. And so I thought, since most of us are most grounded in those birds that would come to our feeders, these are a group of birds called passerines, we'll start with that as our reference, because how many people have ever found a bird's nest? Okay, and so you followed through, or you have a nest box and the little wren came in there, and you kind of followed through with their life cycle. They lay the eggs, they rear their chicks, the chicks fledge, that sort of thing. I'll never forget, we had bush tits nesting in a bush out in front of us. They make these beautiful little sacks that have made out of the fluffy stuff from a willow tree. And it's this beautifully insulated sock. And I don't know, 8 or 9 little babies came out of there, and they all lined up on a bush. It's shoulder to shoulder. So we can think about these passerine birds. They may live 5 years. Some of them live as much as 10 years. And we'll let the bird geeks tell us what this red thing is. Tanager, summer tanager. Never mind. They live a much shorter period of time than marine birds. I would direct your attention. You probably won't see albatrosses. This is a black-footed albatross. It frequents our coastline. But you probably won't see those albatrosses. But you'll have occasion to talk about those birds that are further offshore that you'll never get to see from land, because this is as close you're going to get unless you're on a boat. So it's really fun to say, well, and further out there are these things. Well, there's a Laysan albatross on Laysan Island in the Hawaiian island chains named Wisdom. Has anybody ever heard of Wisdom? Wisdom is on the nest right now. She is 62 years old. And she breeds every year. She comes back. So that's just an example of an albatross that lives in the Hawaiian Islands. A scientist, put a metal band around the leg of it, but it was an adult bird, I believe, when it was first banded. So they don't know exactly how old Wisdom is, but they've been tracking her for 60 years. They have to recapture her because the metal bands that they put around that have the individual marking numbers on them wear out in the ocean environment. So they've had to reband this bird a couple times just to keep track of her. Anyway, so the point is these birds live quite a good deal longer than regular birds. They may live longer, but they don't lay as many eggs as songbirds do, passerine birds do. Many of them only lay one egg. Wisdom only lays one egg, and the common murres that are off our coast here also only lay one egg, but some may lay as many as 5. It takes quite a while for them to incubate their eggs. So they put a lot of effort and energy into each individual egg, whereas passerines can package really small eggs, because think of development as a continuous process. The female lays an egg, and that egg has a prepackaged food supply in it. So the earliest stages of development of a bird happens inside this capsule of the egg. But development is continuous, so it just depends on what part of the development happens while you're in the egg and what part of it happens after you come out of the egg. Because the females or the adults that are caring for the eggs don't have to infuse any energy while the bird is in the egg, because the bird has prepackaged energy while it's in the egg. But then once the bird comes out of the egg, then the adults have to subsidize the energy supply for that developing young. So the incubation period is quite long on these things because the birds invest a lot of upfront energy in the egg. So the egg development, a good chunk of the fetus, the embryo's development happens while it's in the egg. But then once the egg hatches, then there's adult nest care that happens. And the time between hatching and the time where chick independence happens is the fledging period. And that's also a very extended time period compared to songbirds. In the southern hemisphere, the great albatrosses of the southern hemisphere of the Antarctic Peninsula and the southern ocean islands, some of those birds have such long chick care periods. The great albatrosses, like wandering albatrosses and royal albatrosses, can only nest every other year because the entire breeding cycle is longer than a year. Our northern hemisphere albatrosses have annual breeding cycles because they're smaller birds and they can manage to get one entire breeding cycle in a year. It's a complicated thing to make a life in the ocean. Feeding, finding food, navigating, learning the ways of the ocean is complicated. And so it takes much longer for marine birds to come to sexual maturity than it does for the shorter-lived songbirds. Many songbirds are capable of breeding the year following their hatching. That is not the case for marine birds. So here we go. They live a long time. They lay smaller clutches. They have a really long incubation period. It takes a long time for them to rear their chicks, and it takes a long time for them to become sexually mature so that they can lay their own eggs and participate in breeding. So I've really focused right now on this life cycle that has to do with their breeding season. There's the other portion of the year that these birds get to spend in the non-breeding season. And that's where some really amazing contrasts can happen. There's a few birds where their breeding and their non-breeding distribution is similar. The pigeon guillemot, a bird that nests out here on the sea stacks at Bandon, nests in our area, and it spends its non-breeding time in the same environment that it spends in its breeding range. So that's an example of a bird when you're looking at a bird just to say, I'm seeing it in summer because that's typically when we do our interpretive services. So that's typically going to be birds during the breeding season. If you're doing the whale watching, then you get to see those winter birds, and we'll catch a few of those. But you have to think about what season you're looking at across the sea just to say, well, am I looking at birds that would be breeding this time of year, or am I looking at birds that are in the non-breeding season? And the non-breeders have much more discretion to move about and satisfy their needs in the non-breeding season. Because all these seabirds have to nest on land. So there has to be a place for them to lay their eggs. And that constrains where they can be during the breeding season. But here we have another example where the non-breeding distribution is completely different than the breeding distribution. And I have the example of the little Leach's storm petrel. That's the most abundant breeding seabird in Oregon, particularly on the soil-covered rocks south of here down in Curry County. There might be, what is there, 1 million Leach's storm petrels, 500,000, 1 million. There are certainly hundreds of thousands, approaching millions of these small robin-sized seabirds that nest in burrows, that nest right on our immediate coastline on islands that we can see from shore. But in the non-breeding season, they can fly out into the Central Pacific Ocean thousands of miles from shore. And that's where you are likely to encounter them then. So you just say, well, why is that the case? Well, that's because from an evolutionary perspective, that is a lifestyle that allows this particular species to survive. They pick food from the surface of the water. There is prey items in the surface of the water. And these birds have developed these traditions, behavioral traditions, where if you don't go there, you may not survive as well as if you do go there. And through evolutionary time and multiple generations, the population that you end up with had this tradition of flying out into the ocean in the non-breeding season. So, as I mentioned before, the place that you come to nest is quite constrained. These birds are very vulnerable to predation. Some birds can barely walk on land because they're so well adapted for life at sea. They have these webbed feet. Life is being adapted to a lifestyle in the ocean environment is more important almost than being adapted to a lifestyle on the land. And so they sacrifice capabilities on land, which means you've seen the common murres, right? They just waddle around. They're really feeble on land. And so because of that, they're also highly vulnerable to predation. So they've got to find an offshore island somewhere or a cliff face somewhere that is free of predators. But then it also has to be, these islands have to be somewhere near where there's food, because there's some oceanic islands that are out in these ocean desert environments. So they might be suitable places to nest, but then you're stuck trying to find food to deliver to a chick because you're living in an ocean desert area. We're really lucky in Oregon. The Oregon coast is this place that's called an eastern boundary current. And oceanographers think of oceans as the center of their world. And so the eastern portion of an ocean is the west coast of a continent. So eastern boundary currents happen along western coastlines. And eastern boundary currents are the most productive ocean areas on the planet. And we happen to live on a west coast continent of the largest ocean on the planet, and it's one of the most productive ocean areas in the world. There's a couple of other areas in the world that are as productive off the coast of Chile and off the coast of Africa. So we're like in the top 3 of the most productive ocean areas on planet Earth. And we also have enough of an interesting geology that has created these islands that are suitable habitat for nesting seabirds. So we're lucky to have that combination of a rich ocean environment and suitable nesting habitat for birds. And so the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge is part of this Bandon Marsh complex. They manage these 1,850 rocks and islets that are scattered along our coast, mostly concentrated in southern Oregon and northern Oregon. There's kind of a gap there in the Oregon dunes where there aren't any of these islands. So southern Oregon is really the hot spot for nesting seabirds in our state. It's interesting that even though there's 1,850 rocks and islets, it's a designated wilderness area, and to my knowledge, it's the smallest federally designated wilderness area because the aggregate total of all this is less than 200 acres. So they're pretty much hot spots. So now we can go through, okay, what are you going to see on these islands? And there's a whole cluster of birds in the North Pacific Ocean that have developed around this incredible productivity. And the way they explore the marine environment is to be able to adapt to flying using their wings underwater. So the ocean environment has this two-dimensional surface, but it's a deep place. And if it's possible to get below the surface, then you can exploit a three-dimensional area. And many seabirds have developed adaptations that allow them to dive and explore below the ocean surface. Not all, but this group of birds that use their wings to fly underwater are collectively called alcids. And the North Pacific Ocean is got the most diversity of alcids of anywhere on Earth. Alcids are our wing-propelled underwater divers. And so we have remarkable diversity of this particular group of birds. And I've listed 6, but I left one out. This is a test. Go, Robin.
Rhinoceros.
Yeah, rhinoceros auklet is missing. I looked at it last night, like, yeah, where am I going to put rhinoceros auklet in this thing? But yes, there's one other species of nocturnal nesters that I actually see in the wintertime right at the mouth of Coos Bay. I don't know if you get them out here at the harbor entrance at the mouth of the Coquille, but they're worth looking for. So we'll go through a few of them. Common murres, everybody in this room should know about common murres because these rocks at Bandon are one of the biggest common murre colonies in the state. If you go out and look at cat and kittens out past Elephant Rock, it's in the summertime, it's wall to wall. Is there 15 or 20,000 nesting pairs after that fashion out there? These birds come to these islands. They make these winter visits. How carefully are you tracking them?
Yeah, they're here this week.
Yeah, so they pre-nesting, they come in this mass and they just like, all of a sudden thousands of them show up and sit on the island, but they're all nervous and jittery, and then they take off, but they're sussing it out. And they're all sort of looking for real estate, I guess, or at least looking for the real estate that they might have been to, the exact spot they might have nested for the last 15 years. So, and they're pair bonding, they're saying, hey, what's up? You know, because these are monogamous birds. They don't necessarily hang out together in the non-breeding season, but they get back together during the breeding season. And so they all look the same to us. But there's a whole lot of voice recognition, visual recognition that's all happening in this pre-breeding thing, this flux. And I'm really excited to know that there's a couple of you folks at least that are aware of this phenomena because it's subtle, even though you just need to be paying attention, and you're more likely to encounter it if you're aware that it's going to happen. So you can sort of focus your attention over that direction. This is how they nest. They nest in very, very dense colonies. Their territory, if you can think of a nesting territory, is as far as they can reach with their bill. And so there's a whole lot of interplay and interaction goes on there. They nest on bare rock. They don't nest on soil-covered islands. So here we have 200 acres of real estate, and these guys have specialized on only the rock stuff. So they're not on the soil-covered islands. So if you take Goat Island out of that down in Curry County, you know, that's 15 of those 200 acres. So again, think of the constraints of the spatial constraints that these birds are confronted with. They don't build a nest. They lay an egg square under the rock and they incubate it on their feet. And they lay a single egg. And that egg has a very peculiar shape. It's really pointy, tapered at one end. And that's because if it was on this table and you pushed it, it would go in a circle. But the interesting thing about the myrrh that is quite unique, and I don't know of any other examples of any other seabirds that do this, but the chicks that are born, again, remember the common myrrh is one of these wing-propelled underwater divers. So during the nest, after hatching, but before fledging, the adults have to subsidize the food. And even here at Bandon, the birds may have to fly 50 miles to find herring. They catch a single herring or a single anchovy and fly up 50 miles back to the nest. That is a lot of work for a bird that can barely fly because it's so well adapted to flying underwater. You can't have big wings to flap underwater. So alcids have really small wings. So the common myrrh is the heaviest of the alcids. The great auk, does anyone remember the great auk? The great auk was an alcid, but it was a flightless bird. Because it was just too heavy, it completely forsake the ability to fly in air. The common myrrh is right at that balance point. It's still able to fly, but it's the heaviest living alcid. So they're bulky and they really have to work to fly. If you've seen them fly, it's like a football in flight. They have to fly really fast and they really have to burn up the energy flapping their wings to do it. So it's a very costly thing to fly in air. And I think from an evolutionary standpoint, what has happened is the chick survival is improved when the chicks jump off the island and follow the adults at sea before the chicks are capable of flying. So when the chicks are about 25% of the adult weight, they just jump off the island. They can't fly, they can't dive, but they can swim. And so it just pays for them to swim and follow the adult. And it goes even one step further, because then once the adult is out there with the fish and the chick, the adults all birds have to replace their feathers. And the common myrrh replaces all of its flight feathers all at once. So there's a period during the chick care phase before the chicks are capable of flying or living independently from adult care, where the adult myrrhs lose their ability to fly. And they become flightless, wing-propelled underwater divers. Because shedding those primary feathers gives them much better performance underwater. And since they're required now to feed themselves as well as the chick, if you can get out in a productive area with fish and not have to bother flying back and forth to an island, you've just increased the odds that your chick will be successful. And so it's just evolution doesn't have a direction or a purpose. Evolution just sifts out what works. And it turns out that for this particular species, this is the process that's developed that works.
How deep do they dive?
They can dive 500, 600 feet deep. They can hold their breath. This bird that weighs 2 pounds can hold their breath for a minute. They're remarkable. So you could go into the whole dive physiology of these things. They're awesome. They're really, really good at exploiting the three-dimensional environment of the ocean.
I have one question. Now that the chicks are in the water, but they can't fly, then they just stay in the water till they're old enough or big enough?
Till they grow their own flight feathers. But you can see that picture back there. There's this little fluffy chick that's in the middle. They don't even have their adult feathers yet. And so when they jump off of these cliffs, up in Alaska, some of these cliffs are 1,000 feet high, and they just bang off the sides of the rocks. If you get to see videos, these days you can just YouTube common myrrh fledging, and it's like, oh. And the adults are down at the bottom. The other quirk that's quite unusual about this species is the female puts a whole bunch of energy into the egg, one egg. Both adults care for incubation duties, but when the chicks jump, it's almost exclusively the males that are responsible for post. It's not fledging, what do you call fledging? It's post nesting care. Yeah.
So do the chicks learn to dive before they get their flight wings so that they?
Yeah, well, they get hungry, and part of that is the training, is the chicks are going, man, I'd like another fish. They seem to come up from the bottom. I'm gonna follow my adult down. So yeah, it's that the evidence of that training and that learning about feeding is really an evidence of the Caspian terns that nest up on the Columbia River. The Caspian terns come down here, but you'll hear the adults and the chicks. The chicks make this call, and the adults make this ah. It's completely different, and you'll see two terns. Terns are diving birds. They're plunge divers. They look from the sky and then dive down into the water. They can't dive underwater, but they can plunge into the water. Well, that behavior, the chicks hovering around watching the adult dive, and as the season progresses, the chicks follow the adults down into the water and go, oh, I get this, and it goes from there. So pigeon guillemot, another one of these alcids, wind-propelled underwater divers. I like guillemots. Jan and I studied them for quite a number of years, that nested under a dock in Coos Bay. They're quite distinctive, really coastal. That's the one that I showed you. Its non-breeding range is the same as its breeding range. But I think they're cool because I like colorful black birds, and when one of these guys opens their mouth, it's like, whew, look at that. They have completely different nesting characteristics. They like to nest in little crevices or in shallow burrows that they nest on cliff faces, not on cliff tops. They're smaller than murres are and more vulnerable to predation. Like a gull could eat these things. So you have to be careful there. Murres are big enough, they nest in dense enough colonies, they can defend themselves from gull predators, because gulls nest there. So here's Jan's hand when we were courting before we got married. And here's some pigeon guillemot chicks that are just out of the nest. Pigeon guillemots lay 1 or 2 eggs, and that's what got me interested, just to say, geez, if these murres can only lay 1 egg, they put all that energy into an egg. Here's another related species that doubles the energy commitment by having 2 chicks. So we fiddled around because they don't all lay 2 eggs. Some lay 1 egg, some lay 2 eggs. And so we found 100 nesting pairs of them, the largest nesting aggregation of pigeon guillemots in Oregon, up under Sitka Dock, the old abandoned wharf structure in Coos Bay. And we went up there and messed with them. We controlled clutch sizes. So we just went, well, okay, this one only laid 1. We'll put another egg in there and see how it goes. And we just did a series of experiments with that based on energetics and reproductive success, and followed them through. You can see the little white tip on the end of its beak. That's a thing called an egg tooth. And birds in early development actually have this little thing on the front, and that's what they use to bust out of the egg. So as the chicks grow, they get less beautiful and less cuddly. And when you're pulling them off the wooden wharf, the first thing you do for these little chicks like this is turn them and face them away, because they let it go. This is an example of the fact that these birds look different in the winter than they do in the summer. And this is a winter plumage pigeon guillemot. And the chicks in their first year of development, as they come off the nest, they move into this plumage pattern in the first year of their life. And then in the subsequent year, they start to become that black and white bird. I don't have to explain a whole lot about this one. This is the star of the Shoreline Education for Awareness show. I don't know if you've been following trends, but I'm seeing less and less soil on the rocks here off of Bandon. And that's going to mean fewer and fewer tufted puffins because these birds have real estate requirements. They require soil covered islands because they excavate burrows. And these guys excavate burrows, but they're big enough that they can come and go in the daytime. The rhinoceros auklet is slightly smaller. Cassin's auklet, marble murrelet, all these other smaller alcids become nocturnal. They're burrow nesters, so they avoid predation from gulls and other predators by coming and going at nighttime when the gulls are asleep. So this is an example of one that's right on teetering on the edge. It protects its chicks by nesting in burrows. So the chicks are protected from predation, chicks and eggs, but the adults are big enough to come and go and defend themselves from predation by gulls or eagles or whatever else. Everybody's playing odds for eagles. An interesting thing about tufted puffins, again, in summer, they look like this. In winter, they look like this. You can actually see their beak is really different. See that big old yellow thing at the base of its beak? That's called the cere, C-E-R-E. And you can see that things happen. They actually shed that cere in the winter time. The cere is the yellow thing at the base of the beak of an eagle or a hawk. You know, it's where the nostrils are. But just interesting to know that they change colors in the wintertime, and you should be aware of that. That takes care of the alcids. Questions on alcids? Yes.
Do you happen to know the numbers that are offshore here in the breeding season?
Not offhand, but that is well known. There's a catalog of Oregon seabird colonies that has that information. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has that because they monitor that year in and year out. So that information is readily online. I know that there's hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands. I don't know exact numbers for that. Yes.
There was a year, a couple of years ago, where there was a lot of rumors that came up on the beach. And was that because of the disease, or was that they couldn't swim, or what?
Yes, yes. I mean, all these bird populations have been devastated by this bird flu. So, I mean, that's an epidemic that is really having consequences for populations of land birds and seabirds as well. So, yes, these things are vulnerable to disease and epidemics that will impact their populations. When they die, they'll show up on a beach. But also these young mer chicks, not all years are good years, which is one reason why evolutionarily you live a long time. You lay one egg, but you know, so that if you have a failed nesting season or 4 failed nesting seasons in a row, you still have odds of nesting on the 5th or the 10th season following. So, you know, the whole objective of population stability is to replace yourself. And then if you can replace yourself, you've got a stable population. So these things aren't always successful, and they're producing huge numbers of chicks. So if it's a bad year, you can end up with a very large number of dead animals on the beach. Okay, onward. Oh, yeah. So the gulls. Dave got me wound up about gulls. I'll try and hold it to some rational level. Nesting out here. Okay, these are actually they don't penetrate the surface of the water, so their entire existence is dependent on how far under the water they can reach with their beak. So very different lifestyle. They're buoyant flyers. You know, all they have to do is put their wings out in a breeze and they lift up because they don't have to compromise their wing shape to fly underwater. So they're buoyant at sea. They're good swimmers, but their life depends on what they can reach the length of their neck. They nest on the tops of islands. They actually build a nest made out of vegetation, and they have slightly larger clutch sizes, 2, 3 birds. Gulls, I think, are problematic for a lot of people because they're color coded in their early years of development. So when they come out of the egg and they develop their first set of flight feathers, our gulls are typically brown or with some kind of flecking on them. And they intermingle. There's a half a dozen different species of them, but their beak colors change, their eye colors change. And so they're all the same species, but it's a developmental thing. In case you haven't noticed, our hair color changes. This takes a little longer. It's the same thing with these guys. They replace their feathers, and for whatever reason, developmentally, over the course of sometimes call them 2-year birds or 3-year birds, because some birds reach adult plumage in 2 years' time, some reach adult plumage in 3 years' time. So you have to start to identify how old a bird is by when it hatched, the year that it hatched. And so they call that after hatching years. It's 2 years after hatching year. So adult gulls, I don't think there's anything more beautiful than a breeding plumage western gull. These birds do make choice things, and they are in touch with one another. I mean, they physically touch one another, and they have excellent vision, and they just in their breeding condition, you've never seen a creature that's more beautiful and more perfect. It's because those details are really important for mate choice and for assessment of health and vigor. And so they go through this whole process of courtship. It's fantastic. For those of you who are nature enthusiasts, there was a guy from Sweden or Norway, a guy named Nico Tinbergen. He wrote a classic book called The Herring Gull's World. And if you're in a book club or what have you, and you have this interest in shoreline education for awareness and this sort of thing, you should read Nico Tinbergen. He was a naturalist. He worked with herring gulls and learned a whole lot about the courtship and the behavior of herring gulls. It's a classic work of natural history literature. So there's an adult regurgitating food for the chicks that are on the colony. The adults will capture food, swallow it, partially digest it, and then deliver it back to the chicks. That's quite different than that murre who's carrying one fish in its bill. These birds, gulls, can eat and swallow food and regurgitate partially digested food. So they can forage on more than one prey item, store it up, bring it back. So here's one that's swallowing. An interesting thing about almost all these birds is none of them have a gag response. So, if we tried to half swallow a starfish, we gag. These things don't gag, so they can spend a half hour or however much time it takes with a half swallowed starfish till it gets it down. This bottom left image shows, you can see the upper mandible, the upper beak part is actually sort of kicked up. The skulls of birds have this really cool thing. They've got an extra bone called the quadrate bone in their jaw. And they can thrust that thing, and they've got a little hinge on the top of their beak. If you find a skull on the beak, you should check it out. But they have this thing called mandibular kinesis. So not only can they open their lower jaw, but they can actually raise their upper jaw. The one bird that's really taken that to almost an extreme, I mean, it's its namesake, is the turnstone. And the turnstones have spectacular mandibular kinesis, which means they can move their mandibles. Kinesis is movement, mandible is jaw or beak. And so turnstones can actually, they use that upper beak to flip the stones around. So you might want to check it out if you get a chance, because black turnstones hang out down here in these tide flats next to downtown, but check for mandibular kinesis. So example of a nest, I think this nest in the bottom right is the first western gull nest I ever set eyes on, which would have been like June 17th, 1976. And it was down at Bandon at Redfish Rocks. And a friend who was a seabird biologist put me out on this colony, and I looked down on this nest and I said, I want to do that. And so that's an important nest for me. There's other species that have subtle differences. This is not a gull identification, but be aware there's a half a dozen species. Leg color is important, beak color, size. You can see the beak on this one, the lower beak has like black and red. You won't see black and red on the beak of a western gull, but you will on a California gull. And you'll see these kind of pasty yellow-green legs on a California gull that you won't see on a western gull, because western gulls have pink legs. So paying attention to leg color. You can also see the nape of the neck of this bird on the two bottom images has sort of this flecky brown. I can tell that bird, those were winter photos, because even adult birds in winter sometimes get this flecky brown on their head. Herring gull is a really good example of that. They get a little streaky on their head. Just California gulls. There's one ringer in here, the people in that top left. There's 3 different species of gulls in that top left photo. There's the short-billed gull in the background. There's a California gull in the midground, and there's a Bonaparte's gull in the foreground. So they mix together. They're different sizes, so it's fun. There's one that's really distinctive in the fall that follows the brown pelicans. So we see the brown pelicans. A very cool bird, nests in Mexico, called Hirman's gull. It does the color-coded thing, so that's what the top row of images are. But there's the breeding adult, stunningly beautiful bird. Black legs, red bill, quite distinctive. It's a small, compact gull. They are distinctive in that they have figured out how to steal fish out of the pouch of the pelican. So they're actually parasites. They're avian parasites, and they parasitize. When the pelican dives, its lower mandible swells out and its pouch fills up with water. And if you see them dive, their face is in the water because that pouch is really heavy with water. So there's a time where after they've dived, fish, big gulp of water that was surrounding the fish, the elastic pouch pushes the water out, but they have to partially open their beak to let the water out. Hirman's gull. Right into the pouch. So that's gulls, but we can do a whole thing on gulls. They're really great. Wintertime is a fantastic time for gulls. But we'll move on. Cormorants, we're just starting to talk about pelicans. There's a whole cluster of birds that are pelican and their allies. Cormorants are allies of pelicans. And cormorants explore the 3-dimensional environment of the ocean with their feet. So these are foot-propelled underwater divers. The things that make these recognizable as pelican allies is they have 4 toes, and all 4 toes have webbing in them. So that's toady palmate. All their fingers have webbing. Pelicans have that characteristic. Cormorants have that characteristic. We've already talked about the other characteristic. They have this pouch, this gular pouch is what it's called. Cormorants also have a gular pouch. It depends on, we have 3 different species of cormorants that frequent our coast. 2 of them are primary marine birds. Get that? That means whole life at sea, associated with the ocean. One of them is kind of a secondary or a primary marine bird, and we can get to that. They nest on cliff faces, trees, artificial structures like docks and wharfs, depending on what species you're talking about, or these offshore islands. There's the gular pouch of a Brandt's cormorant in the bottom left. that's a male doing a courtship display, working to attract a mate. You can see how that color starts to come into play. But the double-crested cormorant on the right, they've developed these nuptial plumes, they're called, really delicate structures that don't last through the breeding season, but they look good at the front end. So here's more branch cormorants. You can see the white nuptial plumes along the back, super delicate feathers, but it's, it looks good. So they go through these cormorants. I hate to be judgmental, but you can get a vibe out of an animal, and some animals seem like they have more going for them than others, And I wouldn't necessarily rate cormorants up. I mean, they're successful creatures, but, compared to gulls, gulls are thinking creatures. You can kind of, there's a thing you can relate to what's going on. I don't know about cormorants. They get it done, but I don't know, good. A great place to watch cormorants is up at Sea Lion Caves. You don't have to go to Sea Lion Caves, but you can park at the overlook for the lighthouse there and look down. And there's some colonies there. Take a pair of binoculars and look down. It's pretty cool. So the branch cormorant builds nests out of seaweed and algae. They have a bigger clutch size. You can see they have a bigger clutch size, but look, their eggs are really small. So they have a different strategy than the murre does. The murre makes one great big egg, all eggs in one basket. These guys make smaller eggs, so the females partition that energy with more eggs in a single clutch. Which means then when the chicks hatch, the chicks are very poorly developed because there's not a whole lot of energy storage, prepackaged energy storage in the egg. Both parents take care of it. These birds also do regurgitation. You can actually see in the bottom right there, the head of the chick actually goes down the throat of the adult. And the chicks actually feed out of the stomach of the adult. And the bigger the chicks get, the more enthusiastic they get because they have nest siblings. And when one adult shows up, there's 400 chicks. And it doesn't always go well for all 4 of them. And so this behavior is reinforced to say, if I can get to the food first. And so that's reinforced. So that's part of the lifestyle of these things. Life on a cliff face. So there's the distribution of this bird, and a very, very coastal species. You don't see these things on the high seas. You hardly see these things out of sight of land. So they're spending their entire life just in this little tiny strait along the ocean. And again, because we have multiple species here, there's a brown feather patch in front of their blue gular pouch, but that blue gular pouch only happens when they're breeding. And it's a rare thing to see, so don't count on it. So, wow, look at that distribution map. How different is that? So there's branch cormorant. There's another cormorant species that's really hard to tell apart. Look at the distribution of that. So this is a species of cormorant that is adapted to living in freshwater environments. The branch cormorant and the pelagic cormorant haven't done it. They're just happy in the marine environment. But the double-crested cormorant nests both in the marine environment and in a freshwater environment. The biggest colony of double-crested cormorants in Oregon is up on the Columbia River on a dredge spoil island in the lower Columbia River. There's tens of thousands of cormorants nesting on East Sand Island. There's also double-crested cormorants have nested in the trees out there at, I think there's a picture of it. Yeah, there's East Sand Island, where that giant dredge spoil nesting colony. So they're nesting on this low sand island at the mouth of the Columbia River. Double-crested cormorants swim with their head sort of tipped up a little bit. So that's one characteristic. When they fly, their head is above their neck. Another characteristic, their head is bigger than their neck. And often you can, if you get good light, see that orange color in their face. The cormorants that get a bad rap, this is the species of cormorant that gets a bad rap. You'll probably hear fishermen complaining about eating all my salmon. You know, they've actually gone to the point where people from Southern Oregon, Rogue River, Coquille River, fishermen who feel like they own all the fish, or they're entitled to all the fish, have used these cormorants as scapegoats for why there aren't more fish. They've introduced legislation, and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has passed legislation and provided financial support to control the populations of double-crested cormorants. Yes.
You talked about pelagic. Is pelagic for the branch and double-breasted, or is a pelagic cormorant a unique?
One more species. There's pelagic is a generic term that means ocean.
Right.
But there is a namesake cormorant called the pelagic cormorant. So here's this island in Sunset Bay that has trees on it. The other place, has anybody been up north of Reedsport on 101 North and on Bolin Island? There was a giant, a big colony of double-crested cormorants nesting in trees on Bolin Island. And their guano actually killed those trees now, and the nesting colony has now moved to a different location. And that's exactly what's happened on these islands at the mouth of Sunset Bay. All those trees are, in large measure, they're gone now. But for many, many years, there were no cormorants nesting there. And one season, they started to build nests. And there you go. In 2000, there were 3 dead trees, 74 nests in 12 trees. So that's double-crested cormorant. Cormorant is now this namesake cormorant. It's another small cormorant. It's the smallest of those. That's interesting. This is a different species name. It used to be called Phalacrocorax penicillatus, and I really like that because penicillatus is pencil to me. And in the field, when you see one of these things flying, its neck looks like a pencil because its head is the same diameter as its neck. But I see it's called pelagicus now, so I just have to give up on that. They get these white nuptial plumes on their rump patches, and they also get a little bit of the plumes there. But in their courtship, they rub their necks together, and they break off those delicate white feathers. Very similar distribution characteristics to the Brandt's cormorant. So that's the trio of cormorants that we have here. The distinction between pelagic cormorants and the other species is pelagic cormorants are the smallest of the cormorants, and they nest on cliff faces because they would be vulnerable on the tops of islands. So if you see a cormorant nesting on a cliff face, just clinging to a little bump of rock that's sticking out, in all likelihood, it's a pelagic cormorant. And early in the season, those white rump patches are very distinctive, but come August and September, they fade, and you can lose that. But if you're familiarizing yourself with cormorants, summer is a great time. Late spring, early summer is a great time because those white rump patches are really, really diagnostic. So we also encounter birds. That was the nesting cohort that nests and uses our coastline. But we also encounter birds that, in many situations, even more abundant than the birds that we have nesting here that frequent our coast that nest elsewhere. Brown pelican is one of those examples. They're a much more southerly nesting species, and they fly up here during the non-breeding season and use our coastline in the non-breeding season. Sooty shearwaters, if you get to go on a pelagic trip or a fishing trip, you're almost certain in the summertime to encounter sooty shearwaters. You won't necessarily see them from shore, but just offshore, and you start to get into their realm. And they can be here by the hundreds of thousands of them. They migrate past our coastline, so that's the pattern. You can see they're nesting down in New Zealand. And they fly a big loop around the entire Pacific Ocean over the course of a year. And we'll show you how they figured that out. Here's an avian scientist gluing a satellite radio tag onto the leg of a city shearwater. And here's the traces.
Wow.
So each color is an individual bird. These guys are true ocean wanderers. They fly. Well, let's just see, 40,000 miles in a loop. So, but look at this. So that's where they go. Look at a hot spot off our coast. Those are colors of ocean productivity. So the hot colors, that's a heat map. Scientists call that a heat map. And the brighter and more intense the colors, the more highly productive that ocean area is. So if you go back there, hey, do you think they figured it out? Anyway, albatrosses are one of those, there are species that frequent our coast and rely on our coast that nest elsewhere. And they may nest in the southern hemisphere, they may nest in New Zealand, but they're here every year. And they're here in huge numbers every year. Moving closer afield, now we're talking about birds that can't swim. Okay, shorebirds are collectively birds that can't swim. So they have to exploit water that's no deeper than their legs are long. A couple examples there. I think every one of those species is present on our coast, down to the wandering tattlers at the bottom there. Shorebirds are distinctive because since they don't swim, they're really depending on how they explore the world that they have available to them. Beak shape and size really matters in the shorebird world. So shorebirds exhibit this incredible diversity of beak shape and beak size, because that at least allows them to probe into the sediments and manipulate their environment with their bill. Black oyster catcher, I think that's one of the iconic species out here. Black oyster catchers are super conspicuous birds. So I think whenever there's a black oyster catcher, we're likely to see it because they're noisy. And so they're not super abundant. There may only be a couple hundred nesting pairs of black oyster catchers along our coast, but they're really conspicuous. So we see every one. Does anyone have black phoebes hanging out at their house? That's another example of those things. Whenever there's a black phoebe around, you know. There's not a lot of them, but every one of them makes their presence known. They're noisy, they're conspicuous, they hang out, and they show themselves. Quite unlike a Virginia rail, one of these conspicuous marsh birds where you hardly ever get to see it. We get to see every black phoebe, and the way these black oyster catchers work, we get to see almost every black oyster catcher too. They nest in our area, and it's one of the few shorebird species that do. There's a whole bunch of other species that are highly migratory that frequent our coast, breeding up in the summer up in Alaska, migrating through here. Example here, western sandpiper. Sanderlings, gosh, look where their breeding range is, up there in the extreme high Canadian Arctic. And the sanderlings are the classic shorebirds that run back and forth in the surf down here when you're doing circles in the sand. Killdeer is a breeder here. It's not super abundant, but it's a conspicuous bird. I think we all know that the killdeer is the one that does the broken wing display. They lay their eggs, they're really cryptic, they have highly camouflaged eggs, so they're really secretive. There's a group of shorebirds that are clumped together in a term called waders, and they're just shorebirds that have really long legs. Now, if you have really long legs, you can wade out into deeper water, but if you're going to explore that, you also need a neck to go with it, because what's the point of being able to look down in the water and see what's down there? So the birds, these waders tend to have long necks and long legs. And there's a whole series of those, the great blue heron, the great egret. Every once in a while, we get these eruptions of cattle egrets, which right now, I haven't seen a cattle egret for quite a few years, but there was a time where we got to see cattle egrets and snow egrets on a pretty regular basis. And just winding up here, there's a couple other distinctive diving ducks that you're likely to encounter out here. And hopefully, if any of you have spent any time doing the whale watching docent work out at Cape Arago, overlooking Simpson's Reef, you look straight down off the cliff and you pay attention. These harlequin ducks hang out there. They're a winter. They breed in river systems, but they hang out in the river. They hang out along our coast. And these are some of the most majestic, brightly colored. They're really animated. They're fairly small ducks. They dive. They're really energetic. And it's a win if you get to see a harlequin duck.
You say they dive, are they flyers underwater?
Feet.
Feet.
Primarily feet. Some do feet and wings, but primarily feet. There's other diving ducks that frequent our coast. The most conspicuous one is the surf scoter. Again, here's one of my most colorful black birds. You get a good look at a male surf scoter. If you find one on a beach, check it out. There is so much detail in the color of those beaks. It's like, what is that about? And then suddenly you realize when they're courting, they're this far apart from one another, and that's what it's about. White-winged scoters appear to be in decline. They used to be far more abundant as I've just paid attention here along our coast. And it's actually got me wondering, like, what's up with white-winged scoters? One other highlight species before we really go down a rabbit hole. There's a goose that nests in the Arctic. You can see that dark brown color, the brant goose. They fly past our coast in the spring. So they work their way up. They bypass us in the winter. So in their migration, they'll start out there on the Aleutian Peninsula, and they'll fly directly to Baja, Mexico, nonstop. But in the springtime, they sort of leapfrog their way up and eat eelgrass in the estuaries or surf grass here in the near shore. But really beautiful bird, super powerful flyers. When the wind is really screaming and all the other gulls are flying forward but going backwards because they don't have enough of guts, Frankie's just plow into it. It's really cool to see. Again, breeding outside of our area but frequenting our site. We've got a couple species of loons here. There's a loon now called Pacific loon that used to be called Arctic loon. We see them both in breeding, but mostly in non-breeding plumage. So that bottom left image is more likely what we're to see here. But if you pay attention in spring, you'll get to see that. One of the most incredible migrations I've ever experienced is the migration of these Pacific loons off of Cape Arago. And I did my research on harbor seals, and I sat for days at a time out at the sea line lookout with a spotting scope, and I did censuses of the seals every hour to watch the haul out patterns of harbor seals. But that didn't take all that long, but you had to be there all day. So I had my spotting scope, and in spring, I'd look out past the Cape and I'd notice, oh, there goes 20 loons. And for the course of an entire day and for the course of an entire week, anytime you looked out there would be 20 loons flying out past the reef, day in and day out for weeks. And suddenly they're all flying the same direction. And so you're not seeing the same ones again. And you start to add that up in your mind and go, oh my God. There's this phenomenon that's happening off of our coast where thousands of these birds are just moving by, and it can go completely unnoticed. But that's what they do. But if you get a chance in spring, cast your gaze and it's a spotting scope activity. So, C's lucky to have these good spotting scopes. But look past the reef because there's a lot of distractions on the reef. But look past the reef. Just kind of pay attention. What's going on? Oh, you can just barely tell what they are. They're loons. But it's like, okay. And they just keep going and going. They're not in some mass, but there's just this string. It's like a conveyor belt of them. So that humbles me. I like that because it has absolutely nothing to do with the human condition. We share this planet with an incredible array of other living things. And they're not here for us. They're here with us. And when I get to experience something like the migration of Arctic loons, I'm humbled and I'm reminded that I'm a passenger on this planet, and it makes me grateful to be able to appreciate and experience what some of the lives of some of these other creatures are. So that's my stewardship pitch. These birds are vulnerable to some things that we do that aren't necessarily good for them. Plastics in the marine environment is a big deal. Those albatrosses that are out there on Laysan Island are completely full of plastics because the albatrosses forage for things at the water surface. But there's other things that have consequences for seabirds. Fisheries interactions is one. Human interactions, human disturbance, people climbing on islands, people bouncing their boats up against there, drones, Coast Guard helicopters, aircraft, that sort of thing. One bald eagle can put an end to tens of thousands of common murres nesting at Yaquina Head. There's a gull. When a helicopter goes over and scares the birds away, the gulls move in and they have a lunch. That's a gull with it looks like a cormorant egg in its mouth. Our eagle population has really grown in the following decades. And literally one nesting pair of eagles out at Yaquina Head completely wiped out thousands of murres because one eagle flies over, it catches one murre, but the entire colony abandons, the gulls come in, and the murres get so freaked out they just say, I'm done. And so within a span of some years, there was a major common murre population at Yaquina Head, and now it's a fragment of what it was historically, part of the natural dynamic. So, if you really care about common murres, it's like, shouldn't we do something? And it's just like, well, eagles have to eat too. And what we may have witnessed as normal of that big population of murres might have been an artifact of the fact that DDT wiped out these eagles for other reasons. At the Cape and looking out here, you also see another species in this good news and this decadal dynamics. This is a turkey vulture. Turkey vultures have really become popular out at Simpson Reef because the harbor seal population has increased and there's all the afterbirth from the harbor seals giving birth. So there's offal or, dead animal material available for scavengers like vultures. And the really cool news is there's more than one kind of vulture you should be looking out for. So California condors have been extinct in our state since the 19-teens or the 1900s. So for nearly 100 years, there has been no California condors in our state. But the Yurok people in Northern California have been working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to reintroduce California condors to Northern California. And you can see that proposed release site is just south of the Oregon border. And you can see where that experimental population area is. So perhaps coming to a town near you. California condors are really
on the wing there.
Yeah, California condors are really easy to pick out because every one of them has a plastic tag with a number on it. It's called, because these are all hand-reared creatures. I mean, this is a critically endangered species. And it's a miraculous tribute to some really dedicated people. The entire US population of condors at one point was 17 animals, something like that. And through this very deliberate at one point they captured all the wild free living animals and brought them into captivity. How'd you like to play with the future of an entire species? And they finally figured out how to get them to breed. They did all this genetic work to make sure that of those founding population, they did the best they possibly could to mix it up. They got foster parents to do things that weren't laying. If one bird was laying, they'd get another one to incubate for it. And they've built this population up now to where there's hundreds of these species at several locations. And so this is the next step to just saying we need to begin to reintroduce them to their areas of their historic range. And if you read Life Histories of North American Birds by this guy, the 1920s vintage thing, by a guy named Arthur Cleveland Bent. He did a series, a couple of volumes, but there's Birds of Oregon that actually chronicle the existence of California condors in Oregon. And when I was first getting into this, I read those stories and went, oh, damn, no. And early in my career, I thought, I missed it. And so here I am later in my career with the prospect that we're going to get to see something like this. So this story continues to unfold. Hopefully I've given you a little window on what I've experienced of it, but you're going to be the eyes and ears, because the one thing about this whole business is you must be present to win. You're not going to experience this stuff unless you're out there. And so that's what really excites me about being in a room with folks like you, because I already see that commitment to get out there and make some of your own observations. And I benefit from that because I'm not always out there. But if you guys know what I'm interested in, then we can start to find out what's up. You know, hey, this whale showed up on a beach, or I saw the seal give birth, first seal. I keep track of the sea Facebook site. You know, social media gives us a chance to talk about stuff and communicate in ways we never did. And so it's just really cool. How many people are following this killer whale thing?
How many what?
Oh, there's social media on Pacific Northwest killer whales. It is so cool. There's people up in Yaquina Bay. It pops up on your Facebook feed. 4 killer whales in Yaquina Bay. Tuesday afternoon, we saw them swimming out. Wednesday morning, they show up at my house in Coos Bay. Same animals. Without social media, you would have never known that. And so it's so cool now to know that those animals swam 100 miles in a day. And they're up there, and then I can say, yeah, I saw them eating seals in Coos Bay. And they go, okay, keep in touch. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.